Okay, so architecture, and I've taken photos on location. This is in Old Nice, Vieux Nice in France. And what you'll notice is I've got the two photos. They look almost the same, right? Can anybody off the get-go see any difference between the two?
The one on the right is more out of the perpendicular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. The one on the right is the one I corrected. The one on the left is the original. And I'm going to grab my one with the notes on it here for you guys. So if you can see that, I know it's probably hard because it's kind of glary. But if you look at the one on the left, and I gave you all a dowel, and I'm going to show you how I use the dowel, but for now you can use it as kind of like a measuring stick. So I'm going to use this see-through ruler. Go to the image on the left, and that tall tower, the tall squared off tower, the center line where, you know, it's folded right in front of you. If you put the dowel up to it, what you'll notice is that's not a straight line. There's no way to have that ruler or stick touch the top and the bottom of that line. There's a gap. So if you can see this at all, at the bottom, you know, the gap is pretty small. You know, if I measured from the top, it gets bigger at the bottom. It's curved. That's what's happening there. Even on the right, where you see only the triangle of the building, if you hold your dowel up against it, it's very subtle, but that line is not straight either. It's curved as well. And so what I'm seeing here is when I tried to draw a straight line across that angle of the building, at the top and the bottom, there was a gap where it bent outward. And that's because on a camera, the lens is rounded. And so around the edges, it does the most distortion. But everything is a bit rounded, even in the middle. And so knowing that, there's a couple of things you can do. One of them is Adobe Lightroom is a great tool for folks who take a lot of photos. You can take your photography and import it into Lightroom, and then you can actually compensate for the camera you used. So it has tools that say, I'm using a Canon, you know, whatever, D80, you know, with the 55 millimeter lens made by Canon, and then it will like counteract the effects of that lens. So on the right, I've color corrected it. So if you can see the very brightest part of the sky, on the left you don't see really any detail in there, but on the right you should see a little bit more cloud action. This is another thing with cameras. They don't see a lot of difference in values, so you have to kind of bump it up a little bit. So I always recommend to folks take raw photography. If you have a digital SLR camera and you have the option to take raw pictures, take raw. Difference when you're painting, if you're using the photo on the left and not the photo on the right, and you're being really, you know, finicky, people are going to be able to notice it. People who know the difference are going to see it. You might not notice it right away, but the more you paint and the more you look at your photography and you see some of those little things that the camera does, the more you see it in other people's work. So I can sometimes tell if somebody's only working from a photo and never from life. So shooting in RAW is a great way to shoot, because when you import it into something like Photoshop or Adobe Lightroom or any professional level image processing application, it will allow you to play with the color, it'll allow you to play with the highlights, the shadows, and bump them up or take them down as needed to compensate for what the camera is doing. So how do you shoot in RAW? Your camera will have settings. Look at your manual. If your camera doesn't have settings to shoot in RAW format, your phone will not shoot in RAW. So your phone won't be able to do it. It's going to be a higher end camera that'll do it. But if your camera has settings, again, look at your manual. If it allows you to shoot RAW, shoot RAW. It's a way bigger file, but you have a lot more power. And there are a lot of great tutorials online to help you figure out how to play with that photo to make it so that it looks more like from life, hopefully. But with that said, there's nothing to substitute painting from life. It's always the best way to go. And then the more you paint from life, the more you get to know the subject matter. You can rely on photography more because you kind of know what the difference is, how it would look in life as opposed to from a photo. So a combination of the two. Working from life is really more difficult because there's bugs, the light is changing, but it forces you to be quick, and it forces you to use less color and less detail. You have to be more precise about what you're doing. Think about it for 2 minutes, then put a brush stroke down, rather than just blindly putting down brush strokes in a panic. Think about it for a minute, try and put down some brush work. Don't worry about too much detail. Get in the main color and value information. Then take a photo of the scene as well. Go back to your studio and you can do the little bits. So the next thing I wanted to do is talk about the drawing. Now, how would I draw this? You know, where would I start? Well, for me, I really believe that everything is about relationships. So if I'm drawing, I want to make sure that, you know, I'm kind of measuring how tall one area is or one shape is compared to the shape that's beside it. On what kind of an angle is it? I'm not worried about creating vanishing points. And if anybody doesn't know what vanishing points are, I'll just give you just a quick, brief summary. But a vanishing point is a point where things seem to disappear off into. So sometimes in drawing, they'll teach you to draw points. There can be 1, 2, or 3 vanishing points are the most common. So you could have a point, maybe 2 points, and where all lines come from those 2 points. And where they meet might be the top of your building, the bottom of your building, you know, so on and so forth. They're fantastic to know, but they're not that practical when you're outside painting or you're painting a picture like this, because they can tend to look stiff and too perfect, and almost always they end up looking a little bit wrong. So what I prefer to do instead is take that dowel. I gave you each one of them, and if you didn't get one, let me know. So I showed you before how I can take my brush and start my drawing with my brush and a loose or very watery paint, right? There's another way to do it that I find very helpful. You can use a pastel pencil to draw on your canvas as well. It could be any kind of pastel chalk pencil. I always choose a color that's going to be one of my main colors in my painting, so that because it is pigment, it's dusted pigment on there, it's going to come into the paint. So if I try to paint white over a black charcoal mark, for example, I'm going to get gray, not white. And so I never use charcoal because charcoal is really dark and muddy, and it introduces black pigment into my paint. I don't want black pigment. Now I'm going to choose a color that's not in here because I want it dark enough that you guys are going to be able to see it, okay? So I would usually choose a color that's closer to what I'm going to be painting in my subject matter. So here I would probably, for this one, I'd probably choose like this yellow ochre pencil, and it would give me a lighter yellow mark. Once it's done, I can either wipe it off with a brush to kind of get any loose pigment off or blow it, or you can even spray it with a workable fixative so that it doesn't come off if you want the drawing to be perfect. I never really worry about that too much. So I'm just going to use a Faber-Castell Pit Pastel pencil, and I'm just using gray so that you guys can see it. So this is darker than I normally would do it. What I'll do is if I have that photograph, for example, the photograph makes life so much easier because I can move it and it can be closer to me. I can put it right on top of my subject matter at a right angle, and I can say, okay, what angle is that building at? Actually, I'm going to go with the corrected version. It's on that angle. And oops, we got a tall format instead of wide. I'm going to take that angle, making sure my picture is on a right angle to the surface of the canvas. And I know it's right near the edge. Done. Now that's going to be that angle of that building on that area. And I would do that for every single one of those lines. So this is what I do. I just continue going along, figuring out my angles. And then I would also want to figure out roughly, you know, now how far over do I need to go with this line? Did I go far enough? Actually, the bottom of this right side of that building, the right edge is over the halfway point of the canvas. The canvas would be right here. It's going to be over the halfway point. So I know I've got to move it. Well, I've already got the line there. So I can just go in and move it over and draw it again. And I'm just using that dowel as my ruler. Now I have to erase this line. There's a couple ways you can do that. You can try and rub it out. See, it starts to rub out pretty easily. That's the best thing about chalk. Or you can use a kneadable eraser to just rub it out really quickly. Done. So a pastel chalk pencil could be a great way to draw your picture before you go so that you can kind of make sure that you've got everything where you want it to be. So I know this is going to be closer over here. So this point, this second tier, is a little shorter than the width of the whole thing. So if the whole thing right about here-ish is about that wide, I'm going to go to about there. I'm going to put that as a point. I'm not being exact. I'm not worried about measuring millimeters and centimeters because I don't want to be too perfect. I mean, if you are really wanting to be precise, then you would want to measure more. Take your time, really do a good drawing. But I'm never worried about that personally because I don't need it to be perfectly precise. Instead, what I'm trying to do is create an impression of this building that's hopefully somewhat recognizable. So again, next angle. And then what I can do is kind of come in on all of those. I could measure those angles as well and create the indents using the same angle. One of the things I want to mention is ovals. There are ovals in this. We've got one here, right, the top of this dome. There's another one there at the top of that dome. We've got some ovals at the top of these little light fixtures, and even inside the building itself, there's an oval. Here's one thing. I'm just going to draw this in really quickly, completely wrong, so you can just forgive me for this part of things, okay? I'm just going to eyeball this thing here where there's an oval. Here's what will happen 9 times out of 10. I'll see people do this. Do you see the problem with that already out of the get-go? It might be subtle, but the problem is if everything else is at an angle, the oval should be at an angle too. So if my angle is something like this, rather than having an oval like this, the oval has to turn as well. It has to be on an angle also. So your ovals, that's another place to check. That's on the top of buildings, that's on top of everything. Go to the nearest straight edge you can find near that oval. So for example, on this oval here, I have a straight edge between each of these. I have this one, and then I have this one. So it's somewhere in between, but it's closer to that one. So I'm going to go down this way and just kind of get as close as I can. Move this aside, draw a line. Now that's the center point of my oval. So I know my oval is going to be more on this kind of an angle. Can you see the ghosted image of the first oval I did? Ovals are almost always on an angle.